Hello, and welcome back to Kings Across the Pod, the official podcast of the KCL American Politics Society, hosted by Roar News. My name is Patrick Schnecker. I'm the president of the American Politics Society, and I'll be your host today. At the time of recording this, it has been exactly 2 weeks since Donald Trump has been elected the 47th president of the United States. Over the past 14 days, we have seen his next cabinet take a pretty clear shape, and I can confidently say that beyond the political disagreements that his supporters and critiques have, the one thing that everyone can agree on is that his cabinet guarantees one thing: entertainment. We have seen a mix of figures from the political establishment, a new wave of Republicans, and some entirely new faces in the world of politics being appointed as America's next set of leaders. To discuss Trump's series of cabinet appointments and everything that comes with it, I'm so excited to present my predecessor as president and the founder of the KCL American Politics Society 2 years ago, Matteo Cardarelli. Matteo, it's been a while since you've been on one of these podcasts, so I'll make sure to go pretty easy on you today. Welcome.
Yeah, thanks, Patrick. It's good to be back.
Let's get straight into it because there's a lot to discuss. There's a lot to catch up on between the two of us. We do have a lot of history here at Roy News. Let's talk with some of your pre-appointment expectations. Before Trump began his series of cabinet appointments, people had a general idea of a few big names that he was going to appoint. People looked at Elon Musk, RFK Jr. These were the big names that people thought about. But did you have a certain image in mind when thinking about the next cabinet's ideological stance on certain issues, types of personalities that he was going to appoint, or the professional fields they would come from?
Sure. So I think that the expectation ahead of the election, I think, has largely been confirmed by the appointments, insofar as what the pundit class was predicting was that this time around, Trump 2.0 would prioritize loyalty and ideological purity over expertise and a particular sort of policy vision. And so, I mean, I think you mentioned some names like RFK, Elon Musk, Vivek Ramaswamy was another one, who, again, might not necessarily be known for their expertise within specific policy fields, but were loyal surrogates for Trump throughout his campaign. I mean, Vivek dropped out and endorsed him, and he essentially ran as a sort of mini Trump originally. And I think that, largely speaking, with a few exceptions in the cabinet, we've seen ideology, loyalty, and sort of these big names come in. Whereas in the first term, I think that there's an argument to be made that there was more continuity with previous administrations' sort of use of people experienced in the workings of the administrative state.
You said Trump learned from his mistakes, appointing politically intelligent. And when I say that, I mean...
I wouldn't say sorry to interrupt. I wouldn't say that he learned from his mistakes, because I think that something that the pundit class gets wrong is this general fear about Trump 2.0 in terms of, he's had a go at this. He's been surrounded by people who, sure, they might be experienced, but don't necessarily share his vision for America and have used their knowledge of the system to obstruct that vision coming to fruition. I mean, that was the narrative around his first term. Now, the second term, as we've seen from his appointments so far, clearly he has this understanding that for a cabinet to work towards his vision for America, it has to be loyal to him, right? Loyal to him first, rather than the Constitution, rather than these sort of higher political ideals. And so there's been a loyalty test. At the same time, I think the downside to that is that he's chosen a lot of people who don't have experience in government.
Right.
And they are going to have to learn on the job, much like he did,
so did he, exactly,
in the first term.
Yeah.
And I think that when people talk about, well, Trump has now learned how to do the job, he's going to be capable, right? He's going to have this ability to reshape the system to match his preferences. They are ignoring the fact that a lot of his surrogates in office are essentially going to be in his shoes back in 2016. Yeah. They are not going to know how to work the system. And I mean, the president is not omnipotent. Ultimately, he has to delegate and rely on his appointees to do and execute, right, a lot of what his vision actually entails. And if these appointees don't actually know how to do that because they're new to the system, then I have a hard time seeing how from a policy perspective and a governance perspective, he is going to be able to implement everything he said he's going to do.
I remember last year on one of these episodes, we talked a bit about how Trump is often kind of seen as this anti-establishment figure. He, especially in 2015, his campaign was essentially run on this idea. He came into office, then he essentially became the establishment for a while. And I remember we talked about, I think we're discussing the midterms in 2022. And we were saying how Ron DeSantis, or someone was, I think I might have been saying that Ron DeSantis might have proven that he doesn't need the establishment as much as Trump. But you said whoever is president needs the establishment. You can't work without having the establishment. So this idea of these politically inexperienced individuals coming into cabinet, different positions, not knowing how to navigate through the quote-unquote swamp, right, to use Trump's terminology. On the one hand, yes, it might slow things down. They might have to get used to it just like Trump did in 2016. But does this, him choosing loyalty over political identity, like Mike Pence, for example, in the first term, they clashed because Mike Pence had this pretty strong political, ideological foundation.
Mark Milley, John Kelly.
Exactly. We can go on. And there are plenty.
And so forth, right?
But does this time around, choosing loyalty above that, does it, to an extent, ensure greater political stability, at least within the governing body, which could, in turn, be beneficial for the entire country, perhaps trickle-down stability, if you will?
Trickle-down stability. That's an expression I did not think I would hear today. I think when we talk about stability, it depends what you mean. If you mean that we're going to see less firings and a less volatile cabinet, I think so. Because I think that, again, these are people whose political brand depends on Trump. I mean, I don't know how many people nationally, outside of Fox News, most zealous watchers, knew about people like Sean Donovan and Pete Hegseth, until a week ago. So their brand politically is dependent on Trump. They don't really have an identity, a strong identity outside of it. And I think that they've also been vetted for their fit with what Trump wants to do. So I think that internally, yes. I mean, it's probably going to be a more stable cabinet. I don't see Trump hiring, firing, replacing as many appointees as last time because these are his acolytes. These are his disciples. I don't know whether the idea of stability, this concept of stability is suitable for, the externals of society at large, right? Because, of course, I mean, I suppose it depends on your partisan alignment, right? For people who voted for Trump, of course, maybe having loyalists in place, people who won't obstruct Trump's vision, is a good thing because it might mean that he's able to do more. And so that there's an actual agenda that's implemented there. For people on the left, it could, by the same token, be a bad thing. And so I think that what ultimately probably saved the country a little bit last time around was that Trump wasn't able to implement everything he would have wanted to. And if he's able to do everything he said on the campaign trail that he wants to do, then I don't see that as a source of unity, but as a source of further division.
Let's jump into the actual appointments. I want to get your thoughts on a few of the big names. We won't go through the entire list because there's obviously too many. But let's start with the Secretary of State, arguably the most important position after the president in the executive body. Many say that the Secretary of State holds more power than the vice president, even, to an extent. Trump has nominated Marco Rubio, who is the senator of Florida, to this position, the first Latino person to hold this position. Rubio, at this point, is essentially the definition of the political establishment. He's been senator since 2010, each election winning by a slightly larger margin, and becoming an increasingly popular figure within the GOP as well. We've seen him make friends with many different camps. Obviously now Trump. Beforehand, he was very close-knit with DeSantis in Florida.
Well, that's a good question. Is it surprising? Maybe not. And I think the reason for that is that Rubio is a chameleon. I mean, he's adaptable, right? And I think that that's one trait that's really underwritten his political career. As you've said, he's been able to align himself with different camps at different periods. I think after 2016, right, he became an outspoken supporter of Trump.
Yeah.
And I think that though he is known as more hawkish, Trump himself was known to oscillate between sort of more isolationist and more hawkish policy positions when it came to foreign policy during his first term. I think this time around, the expectation is that he's probably going to be a little bit more isolationist, more skeptical on foreign ventures such as funding for Ukraine, maybe even support for Taiwan. So, I think the question is, where does a hawkish figure like Rubio fit into this worldview? I think the thing is that people are overstating the degree to which Rubio's hawkishness is sort of set in stone. I think that Rubio is adaptable. I think that, again, he's been vetted. Trump, I presume, knows what he's doing this time around. And so my guess is that though he has a track record of being more outspoken and more interventionist and definitely more of a neocon, I want to say that he's probably going to play along to whatever tune Trump sets and whatever the vision is. And I think internally there are going to be disagreements, again, probably between him and J.D. Vance, who is probably the leading proponent of the isolationist worldview within the administration. But I don't think that those disagreements will spill out externally and become publicized as they were in the first term.
I agree. I think Marco Rubio is definitely one of, if not the most established, politically speaking, figure in Trump's cabinet. And if there is any risk of Trump clashing with anyone on policy this time around, similarly to his first term, it would probably be the new Secretary of State or the new nominated Secretary of State. Let's move on to one of the biggest messages in Trump's campaign, which was that of stopping illegal immigration, increasing spending on the southern border, mobilizing...
You're not going to ask me what I think about this.
No, of course not, Mateo. I'd never do that to you. Maybe I will. Increasing spending on the southern border, mobilizing the Border Patrol, so on and so forth. To complete
mobilizing the military today. He confirmed that he would
the National Guard.
Send the military down there.
He did.
Yeah.
To complete his border security executive team, Trump picked Tom Homan as the next border czar and Kristi Noem as Secretary of Homeland Security. These are two big names now. And became a Border Patrol agent after that, and then was the head of the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, also known as ICE. Noem was most recently the governor of South Dakota, constantly maintaining a pretty hardline anti-illegal immigration stance throughout her political career. Pretty straightforward why Trump picked this duo, right?
Yeah. No, I mean, I don't think there's much to say. I think it's in line with his very bellicose stance on illegal immigration that he's maintained throughout the campaign. And I mean, that was one of the main selling points, I think, for his supporters, for his base, that he used to sort of rally the 75 million people who voted for him. So I think that the fact that he chose two figures who are outspoken and have a track record of being hardliners when it comes to the issue of illegal immigration is not particularly surprising. I do still think that his campaign promise of mass deportations, of removing the estimated 12 million illegal immigrants currently residing in the U.S. from the country, is not going to materialize. It's not going to happen. I think that there are logistical obstacles in the way of that.
Will America see will we see an American version of the Rwanda plan, perhaps? Or an attempt?
I think that he's going to drag it out for political reasons. I think it's going to be in the public sphere. Maybe he has an interest in playing it up because it's, like I said, it's a sort of flag to rally his base around. But again, logistically, I don't see it happening. You can't, I want to say that you can't really go door to door knocking, around the country, finding 12 million people and moving them out. Also because, I don't think that the people in Trump's administration are unaware of the implications, economically speaking, of deporting 12 million people who, in many ways, are the backbone of the U.S. economy.
Well, you have to remember, going back to Marco Rubio, early in his political or in his senatorial career, he was one of the bigger Republican voices that stood for actually helping illegal immigrants get residency in the United States and then later down the line, even citizenship, because he did see this economic benefit. He did see that actually, if we get them paying taxes, we'll increase our labor force.
They do pay taxes. They're net contributors. Rather, that's a misconception. They are net contributors rather than net beneficiaries because they don't have access to Social Security or other benefits, obviously, but they do pay taxes.
Will we see Trump building a wall?
Well, I think with the wall, you'll see the same thing that you saw last time, which is obviously like there is going to be a concerted effort to increase border security. But I also think that he's probably going to capitalize on the falling rate of encounters at the border in the last few months of the Biden administration. Because that's another thing that I think most pundits and most commentary sort of elides. The reality is that the border crisis was seemingly brought under control in the last few months of the Biden administration, at least in terms of crossings. And so I think that what Trump is going to do is there's going to be a lot of bluster, a lot of show, but I think that it's just going to be, the bolstering border security by delegating, assigning more resources to border control.
Sure, but I suppose it's also the challenge of maintaining this kind of decreased number, right? Because we did see under Biden the first 3.5 years, illegal immigration was at an all-time high.
I think that the measures necessary have been put into place now. It's a question of will he keep those measures in place? And I think that the answer to that is yes, right? So I think he's inherited a situation that is better than most people seem to think. And it's a question of, is he going to be able to do that? And I think that, given the fact that he's said he's going to militarize the border, the answer to that would be yes, right?
Right. Now, the most controversial one, and perhaps the most difficult one to actually get approved by the Senate,
Gaetz or RFK?
Is indeed Matt Gaetz,
right?
Who Trump nominated for Attorney General. Gaetz has been surrounded by drama and controversy for years now. Being confronted with sex trafficking and rape allegations is certainly the biggest one. Politically, he remains just as controversial, really. Gaetz was largely responsible for the sacking of Kevin McCarthy as Speaker of the House, proving to not only be a threat for Democrats, but also kind of an intra-party risk. I have a two-part question. Firstly, do you think Matt Gaetz will be approved by the Senate? And if yes, yeah?
Yes.
Why?
In response to the first question, yeah. Simple. It's Trump's Republican Party. The party will do as he says. And I think
do you not think that him going against the majority of the Republican Party and sacking Kevin McCarthy will change that?
No.
He didn't create an enemy
I
of
think that
enough people?
What I've sort of been reading recently is that a lot of Republicans are publicly and privately unsure about Gaetz, but they are willing to nominate him or approve his nomination should he issue assurances about sort of his willingness to conform to party standards, and so on and so forth. And I think that that's born of this awareness that Republican politicians have that's been confirmed, obviously, this year, a couple of weeks ago, that the party is Trump, right? That if you publicly defy the will of Trump, then you have no place, no future within the ranks of the party. And, I think that the first term was helpful for Trump in that he was able to weed out people who may have objected to his more sort of authoritarian impulses or more rash, impulsive decisions purely on principle. People like Liz Cheney, who obviously lost re-election in the primary in Wyoming. And I think that we are currently in a place where the party, the establishment in both houses, knows that the game is up, knows that it has to toe the line, and knows that, as I said, sort of publicly undermining Trump is akin to political suicide.
I want to pause you for a second and go on a complete tangent. We did just get some breaking news. The Wall Street Journal has just reported that Ukraine fired long-range missiles provided by the U.S. into Russia for the first time ever. Now, the reason I want to talk about this, obviously, this is a huge new step in the Russian-Ukraine war. We know Biden approved this 2 or 3 days ago now, at the time of recording this. And I want to get your thoughts. Why do you think that Biden has only approved this after the election? Why didn't he do this before the election? Obviously, we know they've been discussing this topic of long-range missiles provided by the U.S. for the past year and a half now. Wouldn't have this helped, again, complete tangent, but wouldn't have this helped Biden's campaign or the Democrats in general had he approved this before the election?
No. I think that another hot button issue in the election was this question of America's place in the world. And it's something that Republicans riffed on. Um, this idea that America's overextended, it's involved in too many conflicts, too many areas and issues in which it really has no place, and that there are more pressing issues at home that merit attention, right? Um, and I think that that's something that resonated with the American public, that I think is increasingly disenchanted with America's foreign ventures, and also increasingly doesn't understand, why it is that America or American policymakers have for decades committed time, resources, manpower to backing sort of its foreign ambitions. And so I think that Biden's decision to approve this is born of the political calculation that you don't want to be feeding the fire, you don't want to be feeding the flames, giving Republicans more material to sort of go, "I told you so," right? To use their pulpit to say, "Here's what the Democrats are doing," instead of dialing down, scaling back our commitment abroad. They're actually entrenching us, right, in these foreign ventures. And I also think that what he's doing is he's sort of forcing Trump and the future Republican administration, the incoming Republican administration, to sort of come to grips with the situation. I think he's setting down commitments and getting America locked in a way that makes it harder to pull back, right? If he hadn't have done this, then it would have been less controversial for Trump to rule out allowing U.S. arms, right, to be used by Ukraine to hit targets in Russia. But now that he's done this, I mean, it's going to be more public, more controversial should Trump decide to claw this back.
Speaking of more controversy and bringing it back home to Trump's cabinet now, I very briefly want to touch on the theme that I opened this episode with, which is the idea that Trump 2024 equals entertainment. We've seen this during his campaign. A lot of the
It's a euphemism.
big euphemism. We've seen this in his campaign trail this year. A lot of the guest speakers that he brought out. We remember Hulk Hogan kind of tearing his T-shirt and
Sure.
big Trump
Bread and
vest underneath.
circuses, right? I mean, that's what people want.
Now, following this idea of Trump as entertainment this time around, the creation of the Department of Government Efficiency, aka Doge, which will be led by Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy, has made millions of Americans literally laugh. To what extent should we take this department seriously? I mean, logically, do you think in order to decrease, this is one of the main criticisms of it, in order to decrease the bureaucracy of government, do you add another department to it?
I think that so Doge's stated mission, right? One of the main things that they've said that they're going to do is to cut the size of government spending, right, down by $2 trillion. Now, there's a lot of uncertainty around what that actually means, whether that figure is annual, whether it's over a 4-year period, whether it's over a decade. And also, there's no clear plan, right? There's no clear timeline, no clear logistical scheme that outlines how that's going to happen, right? Where those cuts are going to come from. So, I mean, to your point about is there a sort of paradox there between in the fact that they have created a new department to essentially cut down on the administrative state? I think that, well, first of all, it's not a new department, right? It's meant to be a lean commission that reviews, the allocation of resources across the executive branch. I don't think that it's a paradox per se. I mean, I see sort of why that's the case that they've done that. I mean, it sort of speaks to a particular campaign promise, and it's a very public way of addressing this. I think that it would have made more logistical sense to sort of have each agency conduct an internal review. But I think that for politically speaking, for Trump, it probably made sense to do this because, like, as I said, it's a very public way of gesturing, of signaling this is something that's high up on his agenda.
And I suppose if you have the richest man in the world and another very successful American billionaire in a position that they're trying to direct more efficiency into government, it does theoretically make sense. I mean, these two guys do know what efficiency is business-wise.
So
surely it can be translated into a governmental body, right?
I hate to interrupt. I think that the main point about this isn't so much whether it's a paradox, which is an interesting observation, but I do think that that's sort of secondary. I think the main question that we have to ask ourselves is, is Doge's mission appropriately calibrated, right? Does it make sense? And B, is it feasible? Which I guess is what you're getting at there. So taking these one at a time with point A, is it the right thing to do? Does it make sense? No. I think that, right, as it's currently been portrayed, there's not really sort of much guidance, much information about how they're going to cut it down. Like I said, no timeline, no practical sort of logistical scheme. I think that the concern about the state of U.S. finances, the ballooning budget deficit, is a valid concern, right? 6-7% deficits in peacetime is a staggering number. I think that the debt per se, which is at 100% of GDP, I think it's actually exceeded 120% of GDP now, isn't actually problematic because, as I was telling you before we started recording, I think people are always going to buy U.S. treasuries, right? But it's the trajectory that's worrying. And so I think that the concern that we're spending too much at a time when there really seemingly isn't a need to, because there isn't an emergency going on, we're not at war, there's no pandemic, that's a valid concern. Now, I don't think that the way that the Doge has been constituted speaks to that concern. I think it's optics. I think it's a political sort of gimmick. And I think that a lot of the common sense measures that would have to be taken to steer fiscal policy in a more conservative direction that I think is probably aligned with what Trump wants to do are actually steps that Trump is unwilling to take, such as tax increases, or at least not renewing the tax cuts that he passed in his first administration that are going to expire during his second term. I also think that there are pandemic-era tax credits that are still being processed that honestly have no place being processed, right? And there are reforms to Medicare, Medicaid, healthcare spending, and Social Security, so pensions, that could be taken. So, for instance, raising the eligibility age, but that are politically unpopular. And Trump has publicly vowed that he's not touching Social Security, he's not touching healthcare spending. And so I think that the common sense measures, or at least sort of the economically sound measures that could be taken to rein in spending, are also measures that are politically sensitive for Trump and that he has ruled out right throughout his campaign. So the way I see it, given what we know about Trump's agenda, is Doge, does it make sense as a committee? No, because there's no room for cutting unless they actually take a chainsaw to a lot of the mandatory spending and the programs that the U.S. government funds, or to defense spending, which I think is not going to happen because Trump is publicly sort of a big proponent of keeping defense spending high. And I think the feasibility concern is tied to that for the same reason that I've just outlined. I don't think it's going to happen. So, all in all, I just think that it's smoke and mirrors.
I want to end this segment by talking about something very unusual that we're seeing with Trump's cabinet compared to a lot of previous cabinets. Trump has nominated multiple people who have been career-long Democrats or just non-Republicans to major positions. RFK Jr. as the Health and Human Services Secretary, Tulsi Gabbard as Director of National Intelligence, and Elon Musk, who, again, was a very big anti-Republican for a while, as co-head of Doge. These are the three names that jump out in this category. What does this say about the evolution of the Democratic Party in America? Are we seeing the Democrats leave behind some of their more perhaps centrist or not as progressive members?
I think that the fact that there's an increasing number of converts to Trumpism, right, from the left, speaks to the underlying political realignment that we've seen happen over the last 20 years, as what the Republican Party stands for and what the Democratic Party stands for changes. I think we've seen a move away, at least in terms of republicanism, we've seen a move away from the Reaganite ideals of small government, trickle-down economics, welfare state retrenchment, and also a certain hawkishness in foreign policy towards a Trumpian populist sort of position that actually doesn't want to take a chainsaw, take an axe to government spending with things like healthcare and social security, which is, again, something I mentioned earlier, and is also much more isolationist when it comes to foreign policy. On the left, I think we've seen a move away from a fiscally liberal, very pro-labor platform, but ultimately that wasn't particularly socially liberal. Barack Obama in 2008 ran while opposing gay marriage, right, as a Democrat, which is unfathomable in 2024, to a party where its sort of main exponents are both economically very left-wing and also socially very left-wing. And I think that people who cleaved to the old identity of the Democratic Party now see that social liberalism and sort of think to themselves that they no longer have a home within the modern iteration of the Democratic Party.
I mean, it's pretty funny. In the last episode, our guests were talking about this transition from left to right and right to left. And we've seen these kind of, I think they used, quote unquote, inform, kind of mainstream Democrats being attracted to the Republican side. On the other hand, you're seeing Democrats attracting people like Dick and Liz Cheney, like you mentioned earlier, who, I mean, the Democrats don't really want to claim either, right? So we're seeing this transition of this maybe energized, to an extent, youthful, and so far as Tulsi Gabbard, not so much RFK, to the Republican side. And I suppose there are some more possible transitions of the sort over the next 4 years. We are seeing quite a few Democrats come out against their party. A lot of them are single issue Democrats. So we're seeing John Fetterman, for example, from Pennsylvania, who used to be 2 years ago only. I remember we were having a midterms podcast and we were discussing how Fetterman won Pennsylvania on a very, very progressive agenda, who now, yes, it started with foreign policy, but then it moved to a lot of domestic policy, right, turning into a more conservative Democrat, moderate Democrat, perhaps.
I think that that's an interesting point. I think that one is the zeitgeist the zeitgeist changed.
Yep.
I think that someone like Elon Musk actually encapsulates that quite well because in 2020, which I think we can sort of tongue-in-cheek label peak woke with the murder of George Floyd and sort of
the pandemic.
Yeah, and the pandemic, and so on and so forth, et cetera, et cetera. I think that since then the political climate has shifted. I think that most Americans are disenchanted with the sort of radical, sweeping progressivism of 2020.
But again, for example, Fetterman in 2022 was this idea that you described as peak woke.
Yeah,
I mean, his agenda was incredibly progressive, and it's been 2 years.
Yes, I also think that the climate there was in this transitional period because that was in the aftermath of Dobbs. That I think galvanized the left, particularly left-leaning young women, and so that they, like I said, it was sort of this intermezzo period between 2020 and 2024 when progressivism, still enjoyed, I'd say, it still had political currency among the public. I don't think that that's the case today. I think that the zeitgeist has changed, but more importantly, I think that the demographic issue is Fetterman. Was elected in a state like Pennsylvania where the demographic is very much old Democrat.
Yeah.
Democrats to win Pennsylvania need to appeal to the
coal miners, the
backbone of the party, traditionally speaking, pre-alignment. And so I think that the fact that Fetterman is now moderate speaks to the fact that his base is more, right? That the demographic backbone of his support has swung back over the last few years.
Is this an inevitable kind of domino effect within the Democratic Party over the next 4 years? Or are we going to see more and more of these former progressive Democrats turning more moderate by the status quo, at least?
I think that Democrats need to do a lot of soul searching because I think that the realignment that I was speaking about is that, it's attributable really to demographic trends. The real core of the Democratic Party today is college-educated voters in cities, right? No longer is it sort of the sort of urban rural working class, the union worker, right? It's the white
Although
collar
they're still
profession.
really trying to appeal to them. I
Although
mean,
they're still trying
Harris's
to,
campaign
yes,
was middle class, middle class, middle class.
yes, yeah, yeah. But I mean, when you look at the union voter split, it was essentially
Yeah.
50-50, right? And that's a core Democratic constituency.
Mhm.
And the fact that they're not winning the union vote by an overwhelming margin, I think, is suggestive, telling of a deeper trend, right? So I think that there's a demographic shift. The problem is that I don't think, given the Electoral College, I think Democrats realize that they will not win elections if they solely rely on the urban, white collar, college educated vote. And so they, like you said, they have to make a conscious effort to sort of appeal to the traditional blue collar union laborer, right? That used to vote solidly, reliably Democratic and now is sort of more of a swing voter, which I think is tough, right? Because it means that your policy platform isn't really coherent. I mean, it's constituted by a lot of carve outs aimed at specific constituencies. And it's hard to get a sense of what your overriding messages, which I think was a problem for Kamala Harris this time around. I mean, Obama ran on Obamacare. Biden ran on, building back better, the IRA, sort of structural reform, broad-based inclusive growth. That was the message. I don't know what Kamala's overarching message was.
Well, it was we're not Project 2025.
Yeah, which is a negative message, right?
Exactly.
That's not a good way of distinguishing yourself from. Well, I mean, I guess it's a good way of distinguishing yourself from the opposition, but maybe not a good way of swinging undecided voters. But yeah, particularly at a time when all of the other sort of macro fundamentals suggest that voters are not particularly enamored with your party.
To conclude this episode, I want to take us back down memory lane. I know we used to love a good prediction at the end of our podcasts 1 or 2 years ago.
I don't
so
think
I want
I've
to.
ever gotten any of these right.
I am so proud, Mateo. You'll be very
because
happy to know. I'm very proud of myself because if you remember, for the past 2 years, every single prediction for 2024, I said Trump. I said Trump would win.
Mm-hmm.
I said this when Trump was down after the midterms, when everyone thought DeSantis,
Why
including
aren't
myself.
you behind the desk?
When
aren't you behind the desk?
when including myself, I myself thought that DeSantis had that potential to come up and take over from Trump.
You're a
But
better
I
pundit
still,
than I am.
but I still thought that Trump would win
Yeah.
in every single podcast episode. And I would say this in our first episode here at Kings Across the Pod this year. We did an episode of the politics of it all with Ben Evans. We did a live episode for KCL Radio 2 hours before the election started, or our election watch party started, the evening of November 5th. And every single one, I even mentioned that the only reason I'm predicting Trump at this point is for the sake of maintaining that consistency and just looking really, really cool. So now that I got that right for the past 2 years, I'm going to brag about it as a great pundit. Anyways, I want to get a final prediction from you. A fun one. I'm not going to ask you who's going to be the American president in 2028, but I'm going to ask you, who do you think out of the entire cabinet so far will be the first person out of there?
Well, I mean, the assumption, first of all, we have to assume that they'll all be confirmed. And as
Of
I've
course.
said, I think that they will. I think the only one who's a maybe is RFK, but I still think he'll be confirmed because, as I said, it's Trump's Republican Party. So, I mean, really, it's the question is who's he going to fire first or who's going to resign first?
Who will it be?
Well, barring any major scandal, and I mean, given the people he's appointed, scandal is a potential killer.
It's their middle name.
Right.
For a lot of them.
Exactly. I mean, who knows what happens with the Gates Ethics Committee report, right? That may or may not be released to the public. Whether that damages him and sort of bars him from being a credible candidate for DOJ secretary or attorney general is going to be interesting to see. But I don't know. I think that it could potentially be Marco Rubio for the reason that
because of the lack of loyalty and more political identity.
Yeah, I mean, not for the lack of loyalty. I think he's loyal. I think he's made very clear that he is that he's in Trump's camp quite firmly, and that he's willing to adapt himself to whatever the Trump's message is. It's hard to say, honestly. Maybe Marco Rubio. I'd have to see the rest of his appointees, but I think right now it would probably be Rubio.
Interesting. We'll have to wait and see, I guess. Matteo, thank you very much for coming back on. We've missed you over here, and it's been a pleasure to have this battle of the presidents, which some people may call it. But hopefully you'll be back here soon. And to everyone who listened,
You invite me again.
I'll think about it. Yeah. Thank you very much again for coming. Thank you everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.